everybody. Welcome to the Thought Sparks podcast, where I introduce people that have interesting ideas to spark your thinking. My name's Rita McGrath, and my guest this week is Robert Siegel. Bob is a lecturer at Stanford, an entrepreneur, an advisor to companies, a shaper of leaders, and recently the author of a second book, which he swore he was never going to do again. It's called The Systems Leaders. And Bob, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Rita. It's great to see you again.
Good to see you. So we were talking about how a second book came to be, and I think our listeners would be very interested in the process by which you arrived at that.
So I've been teaching a course called Systems Leadership with my friend and former boss, Jeff Immelt, the former CEO of GE for the last 8 years. And we were finding that we were really seeing a trend with all of the leaders who were coming to our class, that they were really struggling with a world that feels like it's in constant crisis and increasingly rapid technological change and feeling very unsettled. And so what we decided to do was, he really pushed me hard to kind of get all of our guests, over 100 of them over the 8 years, get kind of the main themes together. And even though I vowed I was never going to write another book because like the first one took 10 years off my life, decided to kind of like capture all of our learnings from the course. And that's what became The Systems Leader.
Yeah, it's a very interesting book. And I have to tell you, any book that starts with one of my all-time favorite songs is a book that's near and dear to my heart. So those of you below a certain age probably don't remember this refrain, but there's a wonderful old song that goes, "Oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes Benz? My friends all have Porsches. I just make amens."
Rita, Janis would be so impressed.
Anyway, for those of you that don't know that particular note, it's an old Janis Joplin song, and Bob uses it to introduce the sort of strategic issues that face a company like Mercedes-Benz, which is, at the peak of its glory, at the height of its strength, at the peak of its power, and what must its leaders bear in mind as they look at how they're going to make decisions that affect the future of the company.
Right. When I spent time with the leadership team, they really knew the challenges they were facing, both with the rise of China and electric vehicles. They knew that they were facing challenges with mobility and autonomous driving and trying to figure out what their strategy would be. And what was really hard for them is they were really at the height of kind of all of their financial success. This was 2017, 2018, when I was spending a lot of time in Stuttgart. Sales were booming in China. They were growing 10% year over year globally, hugely profitable, but they could see these big changes on the horizon. And the challenges inside of the company, you had half the leadership team and people saying, "We'll get through this. This is no big deal. We've been around for over 100 years. We'll be okay." And you had another group of people saying, no, this is an existential crisis. And how did they deal with those challenges of trying to figure out how do they figure out where to invest capital? How much should they be investing? Should they be worried about Tesla? Should they be worried about China? Should they be worried about mobility? And how do they prioritize things? And then how do they balance the cultural changes of having to bring software into a company like Daimler, now Mercedes, when that historically has not been their strength? And then also, how do you change culture and deal with your works councils? That was allowed me to kind of kick off the book. And when I work with leaders around the world and I share the stories, the idea is, can you imagine being in your executive conference room with your leadership team and people are fighting about whether or not something is a real existential threat or whether this is something of don't worry about it, we'll get past it, we've survived in the past?
Yeah, I love that story. And you follow it up pretty soon in the book with your own story about GE. Yes. And, seeing the digital revolution coming. And, this story, I just read it and I was like, oh, I have seen this scene. I've been to this movie so many times. So maybe just take us back to that moment in time, the argument you made, how you lost and how it ended up with your eventually leaving GE.
Well, so one of the themes that I identify in the book is that today leaders, because of all of this volatility, we turn on our computer every morning and it's like, oh my goodness, what happened last night? We're dealing with cross pressures is what I call them.
Mm-hmm.
How do we balance innovation and execution? How do we balance geography of local and global? How do we deal with sphere of influence, internal and external? And so to the story you were referring to, I was at the time running a division of GE. and I needed to invest in a new technology that was going to take me about 6 quarters to get to market. And it was my division was very profitable. Business was great. And I was trying to reinvest in my business. And my boss didn't want me to spend that money. And we were going back and forth, and I was trying to explain to him that the market we were in was going through a big technological change, and we needed to do this, and that sales were good now, but they would really tank in 2 or 3 years if we didn't invest. And he was like, Rob, you and I are going to be gone in 2 to 3 years and be in our next jobs, and we're going to take the pain of spending the money and take all the heat from the CFO of GE, and the people after us are going to get all the benefits, and that's really not in our interest. And I was dumbfounded. I like to say that I was raised by Andy Grove in business back in the day at Intel, like, kind of akin to being raised by wolves. And the thing of it, Andy always taught us, you play for the long term, you do the right thing for the business. Mm-hmm. And yet this leader, not a dumb person, was basically saying, if we do that, we take the pain and get no benefit. And I'm like, yeah, but that's what's right for the company. And that was that quintessential cross pressure of how do you deal with priorities of simultaneously investing in the present and in the future at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I think what's different today, Rita, is that, you get to a situation where people are having to, you used to be able to keep your innovation group and your operating group separate, but technology is moving so quickly today. We as leaders, whether you're managing a small team or a division, we need to be able to manage innovation and execution at the same time because things are happening so fast. Mm-hmm. And that story at GE was kind of almost a simple cross pressure 15, 20 years ago of how I balance those two things. Now with the rise of AI and the speed with which things are going, men and women who are leading companies or leading groups need to figure out how to simultaneously hit their numbers and at the same time make sure they are bringing innovation into their products and services as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right. I think it also has big implications for how organizations are even designed. So I'm working on a new book too.
Congratulations.
It's right here. It hangs over my right shoulder, and but it's always there. It's like in the movie, what was it, A Beautiful Mind? Yes. Where the sort of hallucinatory characters are always kind of there. Uh-huh. It's just nobody else can see them. That's what this book is. Anyway,
you have those voices too. Good. I no longer feel alone. I feel seen.
We'll do the author's support therapy club next. But one of the things that I'm working on in the book is this idea that different kinds of information environments are best managed by different kinds of structures. And I think what I see, and I love your idea of cross pressures and systems thinking, because I see a lot of business folks sort of saying, well, it was analog, now it's digital. It was that, now it's this, it was that. And yes, that's true. But I think what we lose there is some of the nuance of different kinds of structures that support different information environments. So if you think about a classic machine bureaucracy, if you have relatively stable conditions, if information is really clearly understood, if you know what the right answers are, and your main challenge is operating exactly, there is nothing more wonderful than a machine bureaucracy, right?
Right.
I mean, in those situations, right? You want copy exactly. You want exactly what Andy Grove was talking about.
Yep.
Right? And that's not a bad thing. And bureaucracies have kind of picked up a bad name because I think they're being used in places where they shouldn't be. And I think what you're talking about now is organizations that are built to be really responsive to their environments. And the management, I'm playing with this, right? But I think the management that you're kind of having to use in those situations is much more like a clan. Yes. where and somebody like Jensen Huang at NVIDIA to me would be an example of this, right? So if you looked at it through the eyes of bureaucracy, you say to yourself, my God, this guy has 40 or 50 direct reports. That's a nightmare from a span of control perspective, but it's not even a relevant framework for that kind of way of working, right?
It's funny. One of the things I talk about in the book is I talk about the difference between what I call Globalization 1.0 and Globalization 2.0. Globalization 1.0 was still a hub and spoke model. You had a central location. It was a headquarters. You would move certain parts of competencies to different parts of the world. It was labor arbitrage, low-cost manufacturing to maybe Asia, low-cost customer service to India, low-cost software engineering to Eastern Europe. But I think organizations in the future will act and operate more like mesh networks, kind of like what you were describing, where you'll have a series of nodes that might in fact be equal, that will work together to collaborate to provide products and solutions to customers. And the speed of information is happening so much more. Things are so connected, inside of companies, between companies and their ecosystems, that you have to kind of have that mindset. Now, I don't know how Jensen has one-on-ones with 40 people on an ongoing basis, that takes up time.
Well, what I'll tell you, I can tell you what he said about that. He says he never does one-on-ones. He says the purpose of one-on-ones, is to give people constructive feedback. Well, if I'm giving constructive feedback to somebody, why shouldn't everybody benefit from it? So he does his one-on-ones like in public, apparently.
Well, right. So what's interesting about that is, how do we use communication tools and ways to actually make sure that we don't have to be face-to-face? I think there's going to be a bit of a blend, to be honest with you, Rita. It's, for example, you and I are dealing with this in education, right? How do these large institutions, which are very sclerotic and move slowly by design, how do they deal in a world where information and technology and new knowledge is changing so quickly? And how do we diffuse that to our students and into society? And so, like last night, I was meeting with the new dean of our graduate school of business. And so, she's driving change inside of our organization. Sometimes, like, I may not see her for a month, but the 30 minutes we get one-on-one, we get that blend where we get to look into each other's eyes, talk about things that we need to do together, and what do I need to do to support her. On the other hand, what are all the tools that we can be doing, and how do we share knowledge between each other and between our other teammates, so that things can move forward when we can't be together? And I think that's what's hard for people. We are still a social species. We still like to be able to do one-on-ones and be able to talk to people, break bread together. That's still common. But how do we kind of do it within? How do we not lose that personal side? How do we also make sure that we use the tools that can allow us to be more effective? Which then leads to the other extreme of being overwhelmed. People feeling like, oh my goodness, I never get to turn this off. I never get time to think and slow down. I never get time to really think about nuanced issues. And that's, I think, what's hard for leaders today. Again, whether you're a middle manager inside of a company, a director, a vice president, or a C-level person, the level of complexity just feels like it's going up and up and up. And we have to be agile as leaders to make sure that we can, kind of like that old saying, think fast and think slow.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. So for those of you just joining us, my guest is Robert Siegel, and we're talking about his very cool new book called The Systems Leader, which is all about cross pressures and how you can, as a person, navigate those. And one of the things that came to me from the book was almost a plea for serious leadership, right? So why do we need billionaires challenging each other to cage matches? Like, is this really the most important problem we have to solve in the world?
Right? Guess what? I call them unserious behaviors in a serious world, and we can highlight what they are. That example that I write about in the book. And by the way, I pick on everybody. I pick on political leaders on both sides of the aisle and business leaders from different industries. Behaviors that we know are wrong. That we kind of replace outrageousness in place of kind of decorum. And like all of us as individuals, like what you're referring to when Zuckerberg and Elon Musk were going to fight in a cage match, and everyone was like, I'm going to watch it, and this is wrong, right? And we see so many of the behaviors where people are bombastic. They might focus on trivial goals. We do see virtue signaling and have seen virtue signaling in leaders. We've seen leaders show disdain for customers, and I give several examples in the book. And then the question is like, why do they do it? Well, they get reinforced with clicks. They get covered in the mainstream media. They get covered on social media. And so leaders are like, well, am I supposed to be that way? Is that how it's meant to be? And it feels like that gets positively reinforced over and over again. The leaders that I was fortunate enough to spend time with, are all successful. Throughout the book, there's about 25 leaders from a variety of industries and from all over the world. And they all, by any figure of merit, are successful with what they've accomplished with their companies, with the number of people who work for them, and all of them don't act and behave that way. Mm-hmm. They bring kind of almost this gravitas of personality and purpose. Mm-hmm. They start with what they don't know. They'll talk about what they get right and what they get wrong, and how they kind of try to bring their team and everybody along with them. Mm-hmm. And they're very, very human. And that's one of my messages to the reader. You talk about the plea of like, don't do this and don't behave this way. The reframe that I like to give is I'm a big believer in free will. Mm-hmm. I'm a big believer in free will. And so, we can be exactly the kind of leaders that we want to be. We can be kind, we can be strong, we can be empathetic, we can be bombastic. But I believe that leaders have a choice as to how they want to conduct themselves. And the idea behind systems leaders, I try to walk through what are things that we see great systems leaders do, and then give examples of how these systems leaders deal with these cross pressures. Mm-hmm. And the men and women who I work with, and got to study, they're so inspiring to me. And like I'm able to share moments in the classroom. Someone like Kathy Mazzarella, who runs Graybar. We were talking about leadership, and she looked at the students and she says, leadership's about everybody but you.
I love that phrase. I bookmarked it in the book.
And the thing about Kathy's one of these leaders. Like, she walks into a room, we all sit up a little bit straighter. Like, mm-hmm. She's that strong, and she's got this gravitas of how she carries herself. And, she holds people accountable, but she's very human. Right. This is a woman running a company, $10 billion in revenue, 11,000 employees, all employee owned. And yet, she was described by somebody as an iron fist and velvet glove. She shows her humanity and tries to see the humanity of the person that she's with, but she also holds them accountable. Mm-hmm. And so you can see that with a lot of these leaders. Michael Dowling, the CEO of Northwell Health, who is now going to be retiring this year. He was with us in April of 2020. Right. It was, okay, what was that date? Right. That's COVID. And he's, Northwell Health, the largest healthcare system in New York. And he shows up on our Zoom session with 150 students. And so I dig right in, and I'm being my bombastic self, and I'm, provocative and poking and saying what a horrible business he's running, and the margins stink, and all the money's made in therapeutics companies and device companies. And he's not getting value for the risk he takes. Michael takes over the Zoom session. And after talking for about 3 minutes, he says, I want to come back to something Rob said. He says, Rob says I'm not getting value for the risk I take. And he looks at my student and he says, how do you value a human life? He said, I could make a lot more money if I only treated rich people. But is that really the kind of society you want? Mm-hmm. I got to tell you, Rita, 150 very jaded Stanford graduate students at the moment in time were mesmerized. It was leadership in the moment, and it was so powerful. And that's the kind of leaders that I was lucky enough to be able to study, how they're dealing with these challenges, how they're organizing their companies, where they're leaning on the personal side, where are they leaning on technologies, how do they get it going, what happens when they get things wrong, and how do they kind of show that they got to lead everybody through good times and bad, and that they don't panic in these crazy times that we're in.
Mm-hmm. Sort of amen to those things. And it comes back to something we were discussing a few minutes ago, which is if we're moving from these dominant corporate forms of being these megalithic big companies, right, to these almost ecosystems or constellations mm-hmm. of capability, to me, it feels like the character of the leader is going to matter a lot. Mm-hmm. And their character and the ability to build trust, the ability to maintain credibility with other human beings is going to be essential to a system like that working. And one of the things I fear right now is we're so in our politics, in our business discussions, we're so tilted towards individual gains. We've sort of lost the plot on the collective. We're saying, companies should be allowed to exploit the environment, exploit other human beings, do whatever it takes, to put money in the bank, and capitalism's neutral to, social goals, right? It will go where the rewards are, which I think your GE story illustrates beautifully. But it concerns me that we don't seem to be putting a lot of emphasis into, well, what kind of leaders do we really need? You mentioned Vladimir Zelensky, and you mentioned Kissinger sort of toward the end of the book. In terms of statesmanship, and I just, how are we building people to be statesmen and be serious people?
You highlight a couple of great and very important and nuanced points. So one of the cross pressures I talk about is actually purpose, and how do we balance our ambition with also being a statesman or stateswoman or a steward of our organization. And I actually argue that that's a false choice. Now, I encourage people to be ambitious. That's how we accomplish great things as a species. But it's a false choice between ambitious and being kind. It's also a false choice between, I want to have a successful career. You, Rita, want to have a successful career. You want a lot of people to be, tuning in to your work on your podcast and everything else and read your books. You're supposed to be ambitious. At the same time, how are you and I stewards of our organizations, of the universities that we work for and work with? And so, Bill Damon here at Stanford describes purpose as, find something basically that's of meaning to the self and of consequence to the world beyond the self. And I love that definition because it really kind of gets to that duality of cross pressure that people have. People can choose to be selfish, or they can choose to not be selfish. They can choose to be ambitious and also be kind. Like Jim Fish, who runs waste management, is somebody I write about in the book. Jim came up through the CFO organization, right? He was CFO, the finance organization. He's the CFO. This is somebody who knows numbers and knows what it needs to deliver for shareholders and for employees. He's also one of the most thoughtful and kindest men I've ever met. He has this great newsletter that he sends out to employees every month called Fish Food for Thought. And by the way, when your last name's Fish, you get a great name for your newsletter. And so he shared with me some of the things that he wrote about and has sent to his employees. He's very transparent. Like he says to all of his employees, he says in priority, his 3 North Stars are in order: his faith, his family, and then his job and his career. And he doesn't proselytize or convert everybody, but that's how he filters things, and he shares that. One of the things he shared with me was there was a school shooting by their headquarters in Texas. And instead of writing, about how guns are horrible, guns are bad, or the Second Amendment needs to be changed or whatever what he wrote to his employee base was how he was hurting as a father and as a grandfather, and how just distraught he was that why do these things still happen? And it was a very kind of connective emotion that no matter where one is on some of the more controversial sides, it's just like he showed his humanity. He also shared with me a story about how during COVID at the beginning, he was getting a lot of pressure to basically fire people who wouldn't get vaccinated. And a lot of heat from his board, from a lot of his direct reports. And he shared with me the newsletter that he sent out to the employee base. And he said, look, I have done a lot of research with my doctor, and I have chosen to get vaccinated. And I want to encourage all of you to do research with your physicians and get the data and make the decision that's right for you. He said, however, during a pandemic, we are not going to fire somebody who chooses not to get vaccinated. That's not what we're going to do to our teammate. We'll have to figure out how people will work together, but we're going to get through this together. It was a very difficult decision. He showed his humanity. He tried to be very inclusive as a leader. And he said he took some heat for it. But the feedback he got from his employees when he would go to the factories was just, thank you for treating me like an adult and empowering me. And for him, one of the things he put to me was, he said, whose brand is it anyways? It's not my brand as the CEO. I'm just a caretaker and passing through. It's not even the shareholders. It's the men and women who run the company. It's their brand, and my job is to look out for them. So when we talk about this individualistic nature, Jim's very ambitious. You don't achieve that level of success in business without being ambitious. On the other hand, he's still very kind and thoughtful on very difficult issues. And so I think there are leaders like that out there. I even wrote about Aaron Levy from Box, who couldn't be more different than Jim. And yet, but also a very thoughtful leader and who comes at things very differently. But, these people are there. And I think we can learn from them, and we can see the patterns and look at frameworks for how, the average man and woman is trying to get through their days and just try to lead their teams and do a good job.
Well, and if I go back to that idea of the employees being really the heart and soul of the community that forms a company, and then go back to GE, right? And then Crotonville and all the investment that was made in people. And I had the great good fortune of teaching at Crotonville for many years, and it really was the gold standard, right? And there was a program, and they had competencies, and they had groups of incredibly talented learning and development people investing in people. And certainly under Jack Welch, and I believe under Jeff Immelt, it's a religious thing, that Welsh would say, I spend 50% of my time on people, at least.
Yeah.
And Immelt, I would imagine the same. And yet, 2024, Crotonville quietly gets sold down the river,
Yep.
and the whole thing is sort of dismantled. And I wonder if you have reflections on that.
How much time have you got? As somebody who went to Crotonville multiple times, it really was a magical place and a place to meet your colleagues in other parts of the business. And GE invested heavily in educating the labor force.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting. GE obviously went through tough times, and I got to watch Jeff go through those hard times as he went for 15 years of being one of the greatest CEOs in the world to 3 years of being the dumbest human being who ever ran a company. And what that was like for him.
That must have been really hard.
It was really hard. One thing I watched from that, and I write about this in the book, he never complained. And I asked him at one point, I said, how do you have such thick skin? And he said, I don't. It hurts. He said, but one of his mentors taught him that your goal as a leader is to rise above it. It helps, 9 years later, that he's looking like a genius again. There was an article in the Financial Times that if you look at the various parts of GE, it's actually the most valuable industrial company in the world based upon the products and services that started under Immelt's tenure. But they went through such bad times and they had to break it up. And Jeff readily admits the mistakes that he made when he was running the company. And I think that's the other part of great leaders is, they're not imperfect. They're not perfect. They're fallible, and they'll admit that. Mm-hmm. And back to your point on Crotonville, I think what's interesting is, GE went through some bad times, and there were mistakes that were made, and eventually GE got broken up. The interesting thing about Crotonville is how GE invested heavily in educating its labor force. And what I'm going to argue that in today's world, and this is a big part of, I think, where leaders need to have the cross pressure of how do they deal with and manage their people. Companies are going to need to educate their labor force because, I got to tell you, technology is moving so fast. K through 12 and even higher education, the universities that you and I work in, we can't keep up with everything. It's going too quickly. And so I think companies are going to have to invest heavily in their labor force on a constant basis to make sure that people have the skills they need to be able to, produce productive goods and services for their customers. And I think that's going to be a real change. I think companies are going to need to be thinking about how do I make sure I'm constantly reskilling and upskilling my people. It's one of the provocative lines I like to joke with is there's two types of people in the world, those who have hearts and those who don't. Those who have hearts in times of change and when they know what jobs are going away want to reskill their labor force because they know that they see faces and names, and they know people have families and mortgages. They want to put roofs over their head. And so therefore they want to help their teammates. Let's assume someone has no heart. The economists have told us that it's actually 40% less expensive to retrain and reskill somebody than it is to fire somebody and hire somebody new. And with the speed of technology, with what's going on, whether you have a heart or don't have a heart, you need to do the same thing and invest in your labor force. Mm-hmm. Now, the Crotonville model, I think, was great, and larger companies can invest that much. Even smaller companies are going to need to be making sure that their talent is constantly being, kind of kept up to snuff. Julie Sweet at Accenture, they invest $1 billion a year in educating their labor force to be at the forefront of technology and being a technology leader. And I think that mindset is critical. Heather McGowan, whom you may have read at some point, wrote this great piece called Learning is the New Pension. And so I think that's going to be, when a company invests in its people, right, some people are going to leave, but a bunch are going to stay. And I think that the education is going to, and learning is going to be a constant new thing that people need to do. Like, how do people like you and I, who we now qualify as being experienced leaders, how do we stay current on things and continue to contribute and constantly molt our shells and make sure that we're learning new capabilities? And I think that we as individuals need to own it, and I also think companies need to own it for their labor force.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. There's a sort of an interesting principle that I've observed, which is, if you think about these environments, and an analogy that gets used quite often is the difference between a traffic light and a traffic circle. If you think
Yep.
about traffic light, it's pretty stupid, right? I mean, it was designed by somebody who's not there for circumstances that are probably different than what it was designed for. The people involved in working with it have no influence over its behavior. It's just kind of stupid, you know.
Okay.
Accomplishing some things, but it's kind of stupid. Versus a traffic circle, right? Where if you're navigating a traffic circle, first of all, there are rules about how you do that, and you have to be paying attention to each other. And there's a lot of science that shows people actually send each other subtle signals about who's going
Yep.
first, who's going next. But it's a sensing sort of system. And
Yes.
what I will say, kind of building on what you observed, is I think these environments can be really exhausting if you're not careful about how they're designed. Because it's like being in a traffic circle at all times. You're constantly having to pay attention. So what I would observe some of the better organizations are doing in those situations is they actually earmark and set aside specific amounts of time for learning. And however you define learning. So it could be skill building, it could be visiting a customer, it could be trying something new. So for example, at Fidelity Private Investments, which was kind of early on this redefining work and getting rid of layers and, breaking things down into small work teams. For a large old company, they were kind of early on this. And they take every Tuesday for some kind of learning. So 20% of the week is some kind of learning. And you can kind of choose your own adventure when it comes to what learning means. But you can't be sort of in that traffic circle 24/7 all the time at work, because you'll just burn out.
I love that example of the traffic circle, because a circle, we think about that flow, that's a system. And leaders need to see systems, action and reaction between what's going on inside of a company and between a company and its ecosystem. And if we think about that constant flow, I think that's why we feel overwhelmed. 3 years ago, after coming out of COVID, I burned out and I took a sabbatical. I was 54 years old at the time, and I've never burned out before. And it was literally one of those things where I could tell I wasn't at the top of my game. And I was able to kind of recharge my batteries and like spend time thinking about, okay, what are the issues that I'm seeing, from a leadership standpoint, from a university standpoint, from a business standpoint, and how do I kind of make sense of what's going on around me? And I think sometimes having that space and time to get out of the tyranny of the urgent becomes even more critical when we're constantly always on, which seems like kind of an oxymoron or a dichotomy of, okay, we need to be always on, but then we need to make sure we find that time to kind of stop and breathe. It could be reskilling. Sometimes for me as an introvert, I just need quiet. Like I just need to kind of find a time and space to kind of slow things down so I can make sense of what I'm seeing.
You're an introvert?
Okay, so I can do this. The lights go on, the monkey performs, okay? The monkey knows how to perform, Rita. At the end of the day, I'm exhausted.
Okay.
And so for me, I need to slow things down and I need that quiet time. Sometimes I just need to fall into a book, because when that happens, my brain starts to make sense of things. And I think for everybody's different. I'm married to the most extroverted human being on the planet. For her, my wife, she loves being with her sisters and her friends, and that's where she gets her energy and she makes sense of things. For me, it's the exact opposite. And I think in these times of constant stimulation and constant crisis, sometimes being able to slow things down so that we can understand it, like for me, that's very helpful. And I'm spending a lot of time thinking about education right now. We look at AI. It's funny, in May, I graded 82 papers. They were all basically written by ChatGPT. I knew it, and so did the students. And that was fine. In fact, what was interesting about it is the quality of the bottom papers versus previous years came up. The quality of the mean had dropped. And every year I would usually get like 10% of my papers, which would just blow me away. Like the men and women who would write it, I would just be like, oh my goodness, these people are amazing. I had fewer of those. I had less original thought. And so like we're seeing this transition in AI right now where it's being used a lot as a time saver, an efficiency save, way to save time. But we're not seeing kind of like people learn how to play the instrument to be able to kind of get new insights and new ideas yet. I think it's going to happen.
I use it to just like almost as a conversation partner. So I'll give you an example. So I was preparing for this podcast, and I thought, well, I'll let one of the AIs have a go at it and give me some questions for Rob. And they're all perfectly respectable questions, but they have no personality. And
Right.
they don't pick up the interesting things. They're not going to sing, Lord, give me a Mercedes Benz. They're not going to, it's fine, but it's not, as you said, it's not this sort of blow you away, really exceptional kind of thing. And it was, in a way, it was kind of comforting, because I thought, well, if I can be replaced by an AI, then what am I? I can just have my guests chat to the AI, right?
But what's interesting is, if we look at the ramp of the speed with which the technology is improving, I'm kind of like, if we continue to kind of expand the line out, and we assume it doesn't asymptote, like, it might get there, but it's not there today. And I think that's actually where the opportunity is for us as humans, where, again, think of it as a tool or as an instrument. Sure. One of my old bosses at Intel used to say, it was great that when we had the piano, we didn't have Bach and Mozart the next day. Right. And so I think we as leaders are going to need to learn how to use these tools to make sure that it can make us better and more efficient. And I love how you use it as a conversational piece. And this is like what I'm spending time learning. How are companies deploying AI? And people are figuring it out, but also as individuals, how do we bring it into our everyday workflows? How do we help it make us more efficient? And so I think hopefully soon it will make us even better in what we do, that we'll get new insights, a new way of doing things. By the way, if you've been doing something for a long time and you've been successful at it, and now you've got this new thing, that's hard. That's scary. Like, people got rewarded, promoted for doing things a certain way, and now all of a sudden they've got to do things differently. That's like pretty discombobulating for the average human. And so I think there's a little bit of empathy that's also needed to be understanding, like, okay, this is going to be hard for people. How do we guide them and coach them along? And, they have to take ownership of their careers and how they act and do things. On the other hand, how do we as leaders help them get there?
That's so valuable. At the end of the book, you talk about, in the chapter called "You Can Do This," and you use the analogy of the crab, which I thought was super interesting. So when the crab has, its shell on and it's mature, and it's a pretty vicious competitor. It lashes out with stones and bricks and does all that stuff. But then when it has to grow beyond its original shell, it has this period where it's just vulnerable, and it's a very risky time, right, transitioning between the two. And I think it's a lovely analogy for what it really takes to really grow to that next level, because it means you have to leave a bunch of stuff behind, and that's hard.
Right. That which protected you, that which made you strong. But when crabs molt their shells, they have to. Their shells have parasites and chips, and they're not effective anymore. And literally, the shell constrains growth. And the part you're referring to, there's that great sentence I read that crabs go from being vicious predators to soft, paranoid cowards. And I remember reading that, oh my God, that's just like us. And I think kind of acknowledging that I remember in our last conversation, we had this, conversation where I was joking, humans hate change. They do. We hate change as humans. There's all the marketing that comes out of Silicon Valley, the lies that we tell about how change is awesome and we should embrace change. Change just is, and it's hard for most of us. And I think as leaders, there's the kind of making sure that we understand that it is hard for us. We can say, oh, I'm fine with change. It's hard. And also it's hard for our teams, the men and women who are our partners. And I think great leaders know that, and they say, well, look, I got to get my team from here to here, and my shell will grow back, and I will be okay. And we have to kind of hold these two truths, that today is tough, but tomorrow is going to be better. And how do I make sure through these times that I get my teams there? And that's really one of the things I want readers of the book to take away at the end is there's nothing that we learned from these great leaders that I've had the good fortune of studying and spending time with that can't be done. Like, we really do have a choice in how we do this. And I'm not promising that it's going to be easy. Like, I'm not one of these of do these 5 things and everything will be okay. That's a listicle that you can read on TechCrunch. That's not what it is. The thing about being a systems leader is acknowledging what's going on in the world, acknowledging how hard it is, having some tools to say, here's how I'm going to deal with it, and then like just marching forward. And that's kind of like finding that strength. My shell's going to grow back and it's going to be okay.
Which is really hard. So the rubrics that we put on leaders, and I love this comment about leadership is about everybody other than you, because that's so antithetical to the way that we teach leadership. I've probably got a stack of leadership books, as tall as I am, sitting around this library. But when you look at the actual recommendations, it sort of doesn't make sense. It's like, on the one hand, you have to be decisive and firm and tough and accountable for results and really, push the organization into the future. And then on the other hand, you have to be empathic and warm and relatable and vulnerable and, admit your mistakes and all that. And it's like, I talked to some leaders who are like, well, which is it, right? And what I like about your book is you're saying they don't actually have to be in conflict with each other, that we can make choices about how we're going to navigate specific situations that that perhaps draw on one side or the other, right?
Well, we have to deliver. We have jobs to do, mm-hmm. and when we deliver, we succeed, and when we don't deliver, we fail our customers, mm-hmm. and our shareholders, the men and women we serve. Like, accountability is not a bad thing. On the other hand, that doesn't mean we have to be a jerk. And that's, I think, kind of one of these things, at the extreme. And I'll play the stereotype at the extremes, the boss who screams at his or her employees. And, maybe that was okay 20 or 30 years ago. And even if it wasn't okay, it was accepted. And at the other extreme, let's always talk about our feelings. And let's always talk about, how hard things are. And that doesn't get anything done either, because then basically that becomes an excuse sometimes not to deliver. And we've got to find how we do things and both. And I think one of the things about systems leadership and being a systems leader, it's about right? It's about understanding local and global. It's about understanding internal and external. It's about understanding ambition and stewardship. It's about understanding innovation and execution, strength and empathy. And I think these are things that we as leaders need to do. And that's what I think is different this time. And it's particularly hard because of the speed with which things are going. On the other hand, there are a lot of great men and women we can learn from. Mm-hmm. And we can see how they do things and the behaviors, things like a product manager's mindset, understanding internal and external, how you get an organization to move when you don't control everything. Things managing context for people, making sure that they can understand what's happening around them, doing things like running into the disruption. You have to be moving forward. You can't be kind of just hoping the storm passes, because when you go through big transitional disruption change, you need to run towards it, because what's in the future will be different than in the past. We can actually study the behaviors and learn from people who've done that. And my hope is with the last chapter, you can do this, is that it is a book of hope, which is like, I'm not promising everything's going to be perfect, but I do think there are ways that we can kind of get our teams and ourselves through these very, volatile and different times than we've ever seen before.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I would say one of the things that I would observe is we're really going into this transition from, the world of petroleum and highways and appliances and things as we know them to something very different. And we've seen these transitions in capitalism before, so it isn't completely without historical precedent. But we do know that social choices and the choices that companies, governments, societies make are going to have a big impact on what kind of capitalism we end up with, on the other side of the transition. And I don't think we're talking enough about, okay, we made this choice. And it's kind of like your GE parable, right? Which is, we know it's the wrong choice, for the long term, but for whatever reason, we're going to make this choice today. And I guess I would love to see more people talking about how do we develop leaders who can actually make the right choices.
Well, that's a hard point. We're not developing those leaders, I would argue, in most places, in most universities, in most companies. So I posit that 20th century geopolitical conflict was shaped by political ideology. Mm-hmm. Originally fascism versus Western democracy, and then communism versus Western democracy. Mm-hmm. And 21st century geopolitical conflict, I believe, is being shaped by economic ideology at the extremes. And these are extremes: dictatorial capitalism, uncontrolled capitalism, and democratic socialism. Mm-hmm. And so business leaders are right at the center of that. Mm-hmm. And in a connected world, you're going to be moving between these systems at all times. And how do you know how to move through these systems? And how do you see that? And I think that that's kind of one of these key issues. And I gave the example of Michael Dowling earlier. He runs a healthcare system, but he also thinks about that impact on society. And it's not that the leaders that I study all come from a particular political bent or a particular point of view. These are all people who are ambitious personally, but also see themselves as stewards in what they're trying to do. And I think there are a lot of false choices that are put before us today. For example, you talked about climate and energy. And 4 years ago, the discussion was all about energy transition, et cetera, et cetera. And now with the rise of AI and a few other things people have realized about, we have a big issue of like, we don't have enough energy for our species. Like we need energy, period. The other thing is, you and I here in the West, we'll have one point of view. 2.9 billion Indian and Chinese citizens have a different point of view about what the cost of energy should be as they raise the standard of living of their populations. You talk to somebody from India and leaders from India, they'll say, well, you in the West had 100 years of cheap energy and brought your citizenry and quality of life up. It's our turn. And so they're looking, how do they get cheap energy to help develop their countries? And then a system where the whole globe goes together, how do we be aware of that as leaders? And how do we be aware of kind of what are the dynamics we might see in Western Europe or we might see in the United States or Canada? And how is that different from what we might see in other parts of the world? And like, so there's going to be a whole lot of and notice how in 4 years, the whole conversation shifted so dramatically. Right. And that's what leaders need to be agile enough to understand. Well, why did it change? And how do I now kind of get my team through this chapter and how I think about these issues? Issues on climate change aren't, what we're learning about the planet, like that hasn't changed substantively, but the perspective on it and in terms of what our needs are as a species, that becomes a big issue. I was in Malaysia this summer for Energy Asia, and we spent a lot of time with Petronas, the large Malaysian sovereign energy company, about how they're thinking about both, being good stewards of the energy for their country, and they're a global energy company, how they think about the energy transition, but also how they think about how do I raise the standard of living for people where energy becomes kind of one of those things that allows people to have a higher quality of life. And that's where leaders need to be able to be thoughtful about these types of issues. And to the exact point you made, where do we train leaders to really think about this? And it's hard. These are hard issues, and I'm not sure we do a good job today.
Yeah, I'm not sure we do either. On a brighter note, what I have been looking at in education is, if you think about it, the way that we educate, particularly, K through 12 kids, right? What do? We put them in rows. We have a teacher at the front of the room with a, if they're very advanced, a whiteboard, but a piece of chalk. We group them by age. So if somebody's reading at a 6th grade level, but they're in the 3rd grade, well, they're still in the 3rd grade classroom, and, right? So we have this whole system, really across a lot of the world, that's built around what was necessary to take people off of farms and educate them sufficiently that they could work and live in cities and do factory jobs, right? Where being precise and being the same and having the same background and the same sort of thoughts in your head was sort of a desirable thing. And the discipline of, you show up every day on time, you sit in your rows, you're quiet, whatever. Well, does that make any sense at all in a world where we're trying to prepare people for a digital future where you could be a production unit of one? I mean, this is another thing I see, which is the unit of value creation going from, big groups and big leverage with machinery to being small teams and even individuals. We have our first one-person unicorns out there now. So what would you do differently with education? And one of the things that I'm looking at is all these different models springing up now where AI is actually being used to help students gain mastery of the common subjects quickly. So there's a school called Alpha School in Texas. Very impressive, right? Where, the kids, yes, it's heads down. You got to learn your reading. You got to learn your math. But you learn it at the level that you are. And then the rest of the day, you spend building life skills, having personal challenges, doing things that I would argue have the potential to help you build a leadership capability.
What I love about that and that particular example is, you have, if you think about it, it's highly customized for the student wherever she or he is at a moment in time. And now what's interesting is let's think about systems. What systems are going to fight that change and why? Organizations fight change not because they're bad, not because they're selfish, but because that's kind of the human nature and how the organization survives and thrives. And so then again, how do we as parents make that decision as to what's right for our child? How does government come up with the right policies to basically allow that to happen? How do you not get into a situation where the only people who can do that are the people who can afford it? And like the complexity of these issues are very non-trivial. And then you can see like the benefits, like you and I can talk about it and say, wow, that's a great way to learn. And we can look at how the existing structure doesn't make sense anymore because the world has changed. But then how do you get things to change?
Right.
You know, incremental change versus frame breaking change is a thing. Regardless of one's politics, one of the more controversial Substack posts I sent out was, what if Doge is necessary? And I said, I'm not talking about this instantiation of Doge. How do you get change in a organization like the size of the US government where everyone's unhappy? Like everyone thinks it's not working on both sides of the political aisle. How do you drive that change? If you do it incrementally, you won't get change. If you do it too slowly, antibodies will come up and will realign and new allies to prevent change. So what do you do? And when something like education, and I think this is where there's an opportunity for leaders to try to figure out how to bring everybody with them. You know, so let's start with, well, what's in the best interest of the student? What's in the best interest of society? How do we kind of do that and not, you know, whenever there's going to be change, it's going to be difficult. How do we kind of get through that? Our job as leaders is to get it right and not to be right. And that's what's, I think, you know, what's so hard today.
I like that a lot. And I'd say if we look in the past, right, unfortunately, it's often required a catastrophe or a calamity of some kind before the old systems give way. And I'm hoping we're not setting ourselves. I mean, I would love to be optimistic and think there's a way of having organizations create constructive change without some sort of really destructive event.
That's what I wrote about in the piece. Is I said the way governments get change is you lose a war or if you have a financial collapse. Let's assume those two things are bad. How do you drive change without having to do those two things?
Exactly. So you, in the book, I don't want to lose the thread of the book. So you talk about the five cross pressure framework, which I think is quite helpful, and its priorities, people, sphere of influence, geography, and purpose. And I think we've touched on most of those in the course of this conversation, but I wondered if you wanted to make some observations about those five specifically.
Well, you know, we've talked about them, you know, and I've tried to give a few examples here and there in for example, priorities, you know, spend some time thinking about, I talked about Accenture. I also talked about, you know, in the book, I talk about a small company in Kuwait, Bubian Bank, where this was an Islamic bank that was really having some balance sheet problems. And the leaders who had to come in and take over this bank to try to fix it realized that they had this false choice between kind of like trying to serve their existing customers and also get new ones. And so they spent a lot of time really understanding the customer base of the country. And they said, oh, well, 15% of the people will only bank at an Islamic bank, and 15% of the country will never bank at an Islamic bank, and 70% of the country just doesn't care. They want a good bank. And they realized, well, oh, okay, we can build a great bank. And they went, you know, digital first, really got aggressive on things like pioneering great app usage, using technology to serve customers better. And that attracted the young people in the country. And then they also opened branches, which helped them with their traditional customer base. And within like 5 or 6 years, they found that they could both execute kind of on the core and attract new customers. And I think that was a mindset that I really kind of, I learned from and stuck with me. Geography, local and global, is particularly one that strikes me right now. You know, we're still in an interconnected world. We see a lot of, you know, issues between trade and tariffs and what's going to happen, and are we going to, you know, decouple the U.S. and Chinese economy or not? And I think the answer is we as business leaders need to understand what's happening in a particular region, but also understand what's happening globally. Spent some time writing about Khaldun al-Mubarak, who runs Mubadala, you know, the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund. And he really taught me a lot about the history of the Emirates and how it came to be as a country. They've always been traders. He says the DNA of Emiratis is trade. And he talked about what they try to do is have a friends to all approach. And they have multiple lenses and avoid exclusive alliances. So here's a country that's very small and really kind of punches above its weight in like international affairs and everything else. And he really kind of walked me through understanding how they think about here's what our country needs. But also we understand China's our largest customer. The U.S. is our security guarantor. And that's why they try to kind of like make sure that they can understand their needs, but also understand what are the needs of everybody else around them. And they don't kind of align exclusively one or the other. There's like, we're just trying to kind of move forward. And it was a really very flexible mindset. But also one with purpose. Like, Khaldun is a very smart and intelligent leader, and how he thinks about developing his people, how he thinks about kind of core values. And so there were a lot of ways that with local and global, I found that a very interesting juxtaposition. And we talked about purpose. I think the last one I'll touch on briefly is kind of internal and external. And that sphere of influence, the idea that we have an externally focused CEO and an internally focused COO. In a world where everything's connected, you can't do that. Like, you really need to understand both. Charlie Scharf, who's been running Wells Fargo for the last 6 years, really epitomized that for me. Charlie came in when Wells was in huge trouble, right? They committed massive fraud, and the U.S. Government had come down hard on them, and rightly so. And the regulators were upset because, they'd been made to look like fools, and they didn't commit the fraud. People inside the company were upset that, management had gone astray and had bad incentives. And also Charlie found when he went in, there wasn't a lot of respect, if you will, for regulators and even the communities outside. And he spent 6 years having to spend time between both, going to the regulators and the government and saying, we need to earn your trust back. We need to be worthy of this. And then also fixing the culture inside this. We need to be aware of the regulators. We need to respect them, respect our communities, and we cannot tolerate the bad behaviors. Like, that's not okay. And he spent 6 years going between internal and external, 6 years before the asset cap was lifted, actually a couple of months ago. And I think that Charlie, to me, is that's a systems thinker. That's somebody who really understands the action and reaction. And so that internal and external, if you're the average person in finance, if the numbers are changing, it's important to understand why they're changing, not just that they're changing. What's happening outside with customers or supply chains that might be impacting why the numbers change, so you can help your teammates make sense of what's going on. And so I think that those are kind of some of the key cross pressures and some examples of the great leaders that we studied. And again, all of them, none of them are perfect. None of them claim to be perfect. And none of them.
And their companies are perfect.
Exactly. And none of them, I think, exhibit that unserious behavior. And I write about people who've struggled. I talk about Jeff. I talked about Andy Grove, what I watched him go through with our Pentium crisis. I write about Emma Jiski in 23andMe and her struggles and what she tried to do and what did she get right and what did she get wrong. And I think that's the thing about great leaders, is they're willing to sit down and kind of just talk about what they're trying to do to get things through and how they're trying to represent themselves well and their companies well.
I love that. So for those of you who want to know what this is all about, this is Rob Siegel, my friend and author of this book, The Systems Leader, Mastering the Cross Pressures That Make or Break Today's Companies. So the time has just flown. One of the things that what you said made me think of was, the hallowed business school case study. And I mean, when I first started teaching at Columbia Business School, you could not get down the hallway without tripping over cases of GE, Nokia, Dell, fill in the blank with other things. And I think the sad thing there is so many of these case studies just present like half of the evidence. And I don't think we can really learn unless you have the whole sides, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think that one of the nice things about your book is you don't shy away from people saying, yeah, people make mistakes and they try to own them, and they, we do the best we can. We go from one learning moment to the next. So how do people learn more about the book, about your courses, the other things that you do? Where would you send them?
So you can go to my personal website, which is robertsiegel.com, siegel.com. That's got information on things that I write, and it's got information on the book. The book is available at your favorite bookstore, both in person and online. Go to your favorite location. If you want to reach out to me, there's contact information on the personal website. You can find my Stanford faculty website, which covers all of the 10 courses I've taught over the years at Stanford. And I would love to engage with anybody who's listening who wants to know more about this. And if I can be of help, would hope to support them in their journey. And Rita, it is always a joy to come back and talk to you. I'm very grateful for you.
Oh, it's been a pleasure to get to chat to you, and best of luck with getting the book out into the world where it can do the most good.
Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day, and the same thing for the listeners.
Thank you. Bye-bye.